want to talk to you today about expanding, not limiting, the places where you meet God. So in other words, expand and not limit. So you might remember this. There was a time in our lives when we didn't have the internet, and so most of your bill paying was done in person. Like I can remember my mother always took her pennies bill to Pennies and made sure she had cash to pay her bill. And my dad did the same thing with the electric bill. And life went on like that. So you had to go to a place in order to make sure that you paid your bill. And a lot of times the way you visited people, it was that way too. That you had to make plans to go to the place. I can remember that my father was a coal miner, and so at miner's vacation, that's when you went to the place of my aunt and uncle and visited them. But, you didn't have any phone calls or much more connection than that. Now, then it moved to checks. So I can remember whenever that happened, that, now if you had enough money in the bank and you had a checking account, then the only thing you had to worry now about paying your bill was to put that check in the mailbox or get to the post office. And then, of course, we have today. And you can wake up in the middle of the night and all of a sudden remember you haven't paid your TV bill, and instantly you can do it because we have come of age. That our opportunity to be able to do things is much more present to us. We recently, actually purchased a bed frame without leaving our house, and it arrived, and we didn't even have to pay shipping charges. It's just amazing what you can do. So now, in this age of technology and in the age of internet, there's a little price we have to pay for this instant gratification. And the price we have to pay is we have to, know that it's out there. So we have to be open to learn about it. The second thing we have to do is we have to kind of somehow see in ourselves that there's value to us learning about this. And then you learn about it, and you open up an account or something like that. And then you have to make some trust steps, which are things like opening up a PayPal account or putting your credit card online. And whenever all those things are in place, then you can instantly access those potentials. Now, what does that have to do with the gospel? Well, let's take a look at John's gospel where Jesus is in the temple. This is a great story that whenever you really understand how it came about and why John put it where he did in the gospel, this is a great story that shows us that the accessibility of God is in interesting places, not just where you think you'll find him, but in many, many other places where you least expect. So, let's review. Here's our Bible lesson of the day. So, all four of the gospel writers have this temple story. All four of them do. Now, the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, put it at the end of their account right before Jesus is arrested. In fact, that account, whenever he takes out the cord and uplifts everybody and knocks things down, this is reason for his arrest. You see, so it's a provocation, and that's how those synoptics use it. Now, if you notice where John has it, it's in chapter 2. It's early in the book of John. And you have to scratch your head and try to think, why would that be? Because it doesn't seem like it should be the second story right after the miracle of changing water into wine at the Feast of Cana. It just doesn't seem to be well placed. So what is it that John is trying to do by putting this interesting story right there? Well, what we know is that early on, it's not really a provocation because Jesus doesn't end up being arrested because of it. It's more a proclamation. It's a declaration of something about Jesus. Now, a couple other things. So, whenever you look at the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they call this the cleansing of the temple. So that's what they refer to this as, the cleansing of the temple. And in fact, at the end of this, Jesus justifies that by saying, how can you possibly make my Father's house a den of thieves or robbers? Yeah. Now, that's not what happens in this one, in John. Jesus does the same behaviors, but what he says is, you've changed my Father's house into a marketplace. Very different language there. And you wonder, what is the Christology or the theology that is trying to be made known here? So it becomes interesting because the temple is actually a marketplace. It always was, and if it were still existing, it still would be. Now think about it like this. So if you were a Jew living back in the first century, you would be scheduled or have to or feel committed to going to the temple at least 2 or 3 times a year for religious observations or observances. Now, pretty much like some Episcopalians who come to church twice a year at Christmas and Easter, right? At least 2 times, you want to come. Now, there's a few additional times that you would come if you were a good Jew. One time would be if you had a successful harvest, so you'd want to offer sacrifice to let God know that you were grateful. Or say, for example, that you had a child born. You may want to go to the temple to do that. Now, here's the problem. So, say you live in Cana, and the temple is in Jerusalem. Do you know that Cana is 66.77 miles from Jerusalem? And do you know that the best walkers of that day could do at most about 18 miles? So, a trip from Cana to Jerusalem, easy 4 days. Now, so you have a good harvest, and you have a plentiful livestock happening, and you want to now go and thank God for this. And so, can you possibly think of taking your few prize goats and your cows and your doves down that trip in 4 days? I mean, they'd die, right? So what would happen? They would sell them, and they would have the money, and then they would go to the temple where they have an abundance of cattle and doves and sheep, and they would purchase 1 or 2 for the sacrifice. You see, so it's not a surprise that the temple was a place where that happened. See, and that's why Jesus doesn't call it a den of thieves. He turned it into a marketplace. Okay, now, that's a little bit about, just the biblical aspects of this. Now, what is John's theology? What is he trying to point out to us? I'd like you to think about it like this. Whenever I was in college, I had an opportunity to go to a really significant basketball game. Now, I don't remember exactly who played, but it was at the Civic Arena, and it was being televised, and it was a big hoopla. So where we parked, we came in the back of the Civic Arena. We walked down, and what I noticed was all these tractor-trailer trucks parked there, all these light stands, tons of cable being run, and generators everywhere. And I noticed that, because what I learned when I went into the Civic Arena was that's what made all those lights work, and they needed more energy. Now, imagine this. Play with this thought. Say, for example, you now had a mad cutter out there, someone who has these hedge trimmers and decides to go and cut and snap every one of those cables. Now, say you're in the Civic Arena then, and the result of that is the lights go out. All of a sudden, the cameras used for filming are no longer running. All of a sudden, the scoreboard goes black. Now, let me ask you, would you then conclude that the cutter was cleansing the basketball game? Probably not. Okay? You're probably saying the cutter was shutting down the game. Now, just as it is for running a temple, okay, just as it is for running a televised basketball game, so is running the temple. So you need to have the cattle there and the doves and the money changers, all that sort of thing. So what Jesus does there is he's not necessarily slapping people on the fingers or letting them know that they're cheating people in the way they're doing their practices. That's not it at all. What Jesus is not shutting down is the cleansing of the temple. He's shutting down the temple. You see, that's what it is. This temple is no longer the place where you exclusively meet your God. See? Well, where is? I am the temple. Under whose authority do you tell that? Well, under the authority that destroy this temple and in 3 days I will build it back. And they say, how can that be? It took us 46 years to build this temple, and you say you're going to build it back in 3 days? And then the evangelist John jumps in and says, what he's referring to is his body. Jesus has become the temple. Jesus is the Word made flesh. Jesus is the place where you meet God. It's a brand new meeting place. We got internet, folks. Plug in. It's everywhere now possible to meet your Savior, to meet your God. And that's the good news of the gospel. It's in human form that Jesus took on Godship. The place where God and humans sit down is here in church, but it's also in other places. And we can never, ever forget that. It's also in people. Now, what's interesting about this is St. Francis of Assisi, for example, the saint that I followed for many years, he had a little chapel called the Portiuncula, which was where they went to experience the presence of God. And whenever the friars would go to visit the Portiuncula, St. Francis made a point to do two things. The first thing he did was he genuflected in front of every one of the friars. And then he went and he genuflected outside the Portiuncula and entered. Now, people didn't ask him right off the bat why he did that, but then when they did ask him, he said, because I worship the presence of God in both places. See, it's interesting. See, that's the Word made flesh, is that it burst from the temple. It's not only there. So I guess as we reflect on this, let's see if we can't either make one of those sides a little bit stronger if we lack in it. There's a wonderful author by the name of David Miller. He put together a little book called God at Work. And he uses that book to preach to clergy. And so he talks about it in his first chapter, and he has a group of clergy who have gathered, and he asked them this question. He said, now, tell me, ordained ministers, how many of you, whenever you have this school year starting with Sunday school, how many of you get all of your people in your parish who are teachers who are going to teach in the Sunday school to stand up and you commission them? And everyone put up their hands, yes we do, yes we do. And he said, and you pray for them? Yes we do. He said, now how about this? After you have your annual meeting and your vestry, is elected, and then people are, then elected to be the senior warden and the junior warden and all that kind of stuff, how many of you then have a ceremony in the church where those people come in and you commission them and you pray for them? And they all raise their hand. Now, if I was there, we didn't do it this year in our vestry because they thought that we didn't need that this year. But you get the point. Or like, say, for example, that you have a group of kids who are going to go on a mission trip, it would be very natural for you to say a blessing over them, right? And then David Miller then asked the question, now, how many of you on the 1st of April have all of your CPAs in the congregation stand up and then call them forth and give them a blessing, commissioning them to go and do everything in their power to make sure that the government runs? And not a hand went up. Now, his point was, well, if the only place where you think needs your blessing are things that happen in the church, you might be missing out on something. That there's other places to do that. So, just an invitation today. As Jesus changes the temple, shuts down the temple, to give some thought, well, if that's shut down or minimized more, and there's other things there, what is it in there for me to do? See? So, I'll just end with this idea. I'm not a fan of C.S. Lewis, but I am aware of the Tales of Narnia, and some of you might be too. In Book 3, there's a portion called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so what it's about is it's about the 4 pensive children are going to Narnia to correct some things. And on the way into Narnia, they meet their hero, who is Aslan, who is the Christ figure. And they talk to Aslan, and then they have the courage to take care of their first problem, which is the witch. The witch is causing perpetual winter to be in Narnia. So with Aslan's help, they go and they get the witch to change that. Now, pause. In book 2, the children go to Narnia again, meet Aslan, and this time, with Aslan's help, they're helping Prince Caspian to be restored to his rightful crown. Now, they do that, and at the end of that, Aslan talks to the 2 oldest kids and says to them, "This is going to be your last trip to Narnia." And they look dumbfounded, and then the book ends. Now, back to book 3. So, they just got the Wicked Witch to stop winterizing Narnia, and they're on their way out of Narnia. And now the little kids come near Aslan, and Aslan calls them over and says to Lucy, "Lucy, this is going to be the last visit you'll have to Narnia." And she starts to cry, and she says, "But I love coming to Narnia. I love being with you." And Aslan says to her, "Honey, one of the reasons why we had you come here so many times was that you would get to know me and to be able to recognize me, not only here, but when you go back into your own world with the people around you." So, however you worship and find the Lord, bless you. Some of us find God in this place, and it is a beautiful place to find God. I mean, I look at that tree, and it says something to me. The light of this place. Some of you find your meeting place with God in cathedrals that are dark, and you can be there and just feel comfort. Others of you find God on a nature hike. Some of you find God in an excellent piece of liturgical music, and you hear that, and all of a sudden, you find God. Those are all valid experiences, and they are real. Enjoy them, live into them. But if you only come to church to have an experience of God and then leave, then maybe our view of coming to church ought to change a little bit. And maybe what it ought to be is, I am at church being sent to find God in my brothers and sisters outside the place. If we can move in that direction more, we'll have so many more meeting places for the Lord.